The moving truck pulled up to the two-story brick house on Oak Tree Lane just as the sun was rising. Anthony Williams stepped out of his SUV and took a deep breath. After 15 years of hard work as a heart doctor, he had finally been able to buy his dream home in one of the most beautiful neighborhoods in the city. The tall oak trees lining the street provided cool shade, and the well-kept lawn showed that people here took pride in their homes. "This is it," Anthony said, turning to his wife Denise, who was getting out of the passenger seat. She smiled, her eyes taking in the red brick house with white trim and the large maple tree in the front yard. "It's perfect," she said, squeezing his hand. Their children, 16-year-old Maya and 12-year-old Isaiah, tumbled out of the back seat. Maya immediately pulled out her phone to take pictures while Isaiah raced toward the front door. "Slow down, buddy," Anthony called after his son. "We need to help the movers first." The Williams family had been planning this move for months. Anthony's new job at the city hospital meant they could finally leave their small apartment downtown. Denise, who had just been named the new principal at the local high school, was excited about the shorter drive to work. As they began directing the movers, a few neighbors came out to greet them. Mrs. Chen from across the street brought over a plate of homemade cookies, and the young couple from 2 doors down introduced themselves and offered to help unpack. "We're so glad to have new neighbors," Mrs. Chen said warmly. The Andersons who lived here before moved to Florida to be closer to their grandkids. But not everyone seemed happy about their arrival. Anthony noticed an older man standing on the porch of the house next door, watching them with narrowed eyes. When Anthony waved, the man turned and went back inside without acknowledging him. "Don't mind Walter Jenkins," Mrs. Chen whispered, following Anthony's gaze. "He's been here longer than anyone else on the block. Takes him time to warm up to new folks." By midday, the moving truck was empty, and boxes filled every room of their new home. The family gathered in the kitchen where Denise had set up a simple lunch of sandwiches and chips. "I already love it here," Maya said, looking out the kitchen window at their backyard. A wooden swing hung from a sturdy branch of an old oak tree, and a stone path led to a small garden area in the back corner. "Me too," Isaiah agreed, his mouth full of sandwich. "Can I go check out the treehouse after lunch?" "Let's all go together," Anthony suggested. "We can explore our new yard as a family." After lunch, they stepped out onto their back porch. The yard was bigger than any they'd had before, with plenty of room for Isaiah to kick his soccer ball and for Maya to set up the art easel she loved to paint on. Just as they were admiring the treehouse, they heard a loud voice from over the fence. "Keep your kids quiet. Some of us value our peace and quiet around here." The Williams family turned to see Walter Jenkins glaring at them from his side of the fence. He was a tall, thin man with white hair and deep lines around his mouth that suggested he frowned more than he smiled. He wore khaki pants pulled up, high on his waist, and a button-up shirt despite the summer heat. "I'm sorry if we disturbed you," Anthony said politely. "We're just getting to know our new home. I'm Anthony Williams, by the way. This is my wife Denise and our kids Maya and Isaiah." Walter didn't introduce himself back, he just huffed and said, "This used to be a peaceful neighborhood," before turning back toward his house. Denise put a hand on Anthony's arm. "Don't worry about it," she said quietly. "Like Mrs. Chen said, he probably just needs time to adjust to having new neighbors." But Anthony had seen the look in Walter's eyes. It wasn't just annoyance at the noise. He had seen that look before, the look that said Walter didn't think they belonged in this neighborhood. That evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Anthony and Denise sat on their new front porch, tired but happy. "Do you think we made the right choice?" Denise asked, leaning her head against her husband's shoulder. "Moving to this neighborhood?" Anthony looked up at the stars visible through the branches of their maple tree. "Absolutely, this is a good place for the kids to grow up. Good schools, safe streets, plenty of space, and most of the neighbors seem nice. Except Mr. Jenkins," Denise said with a small laugh. "Even in the best neighborhoods, there's always one grumpy neighbor," Anthony replied. "We won't let him spoil this for us." The next morning, Anthony woke early and decided to go for a jog around the neighborhood. He wanted to get to know the area better before starting his new job on Monday. The streets were quiet, with only a few people out walking their dogs or picking up their newspapers. As he rounded the corner back onto Oak Tree Lane, he saw Walter Jenkins talking to another neighbor, a middle-aged man in a bathrobe collecting his mail. Anthony slowed his pace, not wanting to interrupt, but he couldn't help overhearing part of their conversation. "Property values will go down, mark my words," Walter was saying, his voice low but angry. "This neighborhood has standards, or at least it used to." The other man looked uncomfortable. "Come on, Walter, times have changed. Besides, I met them yesterday. They seem like a nice family." "Nice doesn't matter," Walter insisted. "They're not like us, they don't belong here." Anthony felt his stomach tighten. He'd hoped he was wrong about Walter's attitude, but now there was no doubt. He picked up his pace and ran past them, pretending he hadn't heard. The other neighbor nodded at him as he passed, looking embarrassed. When Anthony got home, he found Denise in the kitchen unpacking dishes. He debated whether to tell her what he'd overheard, but decided against it. Why start their life in their new home on a negative note? Instead, he said, "I met a few more neighbors on my run. Everyone seems friendly." It wasn't a complete lie. The other neighbors had been welcoming. Over the next few days, as they settled in, the Williams family got to know more of the neighborhood. Isaiah quickly made friends with the boys down the street who invited him to join their basketball games in the driveway. Maya spent time helping Mrs. Chen tend her flower garden and learning about the different plants. When Monday came, Anthony left for his first day at the new hospital, while Denise headed to the high school to prepare for the upcoming school year. The kids, still on summer break, promised to finish unpacking their rooms. That afternoon, when Anthony returned home, he found a small group of neighbors in his front yard. They had brought welcome gifts: a houseplant, a bottle of wine, a homemade pie, and a gift card to the local hardware store. "We always have a little welcome party for new folks," explained Mr. Rodriguez, who lived at the end of the block. "Usually, we do it at the community pool, but we thought you might appreciate a more low-key welcome while you're still settling in." Anthony was touched by their kindness. "Thank you so much. Why don't you all come inside? The house is still a bit messy, but we'd love to have you." As the neighbors filed in, Anthony noticed Walter Jenkins watching from his porch across the way. Their eyes met briefly, and Walter's mouth tightened into a thin line before he went inside his house, slamming the door behind him. One of the neighbors, a woman named Linda, saw the exchange and sighed. "Don't mind Walter," she said. "He's been through a lot. Lost his wife about 5 years ago and hasn't been the same since." "That's sad," Anthony said sincerely. He understood grief could change a person, but he also knew it wasn't an excuse for prejudice. Inside, as the neighbors chatted and admired the Williams' new home, Anthony couldn't help but feel that despite Walter's attitude, they had made the right decision moving here. Most of the community was welcoming, and this was a place where his family could put down roots and thrive. What he didn't know then was just how difficult Walter Jenkins would make that goal, or the surprising connection that would eventually change everything between their two families. The first month in their new home passed quickly for the Williams family. Anthony settled into his role at the hospital, often coming home with stories about his patients and the skilled team he worked with. Denise spent long days preparing for the start of the school year, organizing teacher meetings and finalizing class schedules. The kids made the most of their final weeks of summer freedom, with Maya painting landscapes of their new neighborhood and Isaiah playing basketball with his new friends. But as August turned to September, Walter Jenkins' initial coldness hardened into something more deliberate. It started with small things that could have been dismissed as the actions of a grumpy old man. When Anthony would wave from the driveway, Walter would turn his back. If Isaiah's basketball bounced into Walter's yard, he would take it inside his house and not return it for days. "Maybe I should go talk to him," Anthony suggested one evening after dinner as they sat on their back porch. "Clear the air." Denise sipped her iced tea thoughtfully. "It might be worth a try. Just be prepared that he might not want to talk." The next Saturday morning, Anthony walked next door with a freshly baked loaf of banana bread Denise had made. He rang the doorbell and waited, rehearsing his friendly greeting in his head. Walter opened the door just enough to see who was there, his face immediately hardening when he recognized Anthony. "What do you want?" Walter asked, not opening the door any wider. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins," Anthony said with a smile. "We haven't had a chance to properly introduce ourselves yet. I thought I'd bring over some banana bread my wife made, and maybe we could chat for a bit, neighbor to neighbor." Walter looked at the bread but didn't take it. "I'm not interested in being friends, and I don't need your charity." "It's not charity," Anthony said, keeping his voice even. "It's just being neighborly." "Well, I didn't ask for new neighbors, especially ones like you," Walter replied, his meaning clear in his tone. "This neighborhood was just fine before you. People moved in." Before Anthony could respond, Walter shut the door in his face. Anthony stood there for a moment, the bread still in his hands, a mix of anger and disappointment washing over him. He'd dealt with prejudice before, but it never got easier. When he returned home, Denise could tell from his face that the conversation hadn't gone well. "That bad, huh?" Anthony placed the bread on the kitchen counter. "Worse than I expected. He made it pretty clear he doesn't want us here because of the color of our skin." Denise sighed. "I was hoping we were wrong about him." "Me too," Anthony said. "But hey, one unfriendly neighbor isn't going to ruin this for us. The rest of the neighborhood has been great." But over the next few weeks, Walter's behavior grew more aggressive. It started with a letter from the Neighborhood Homeowners Association, stating that a complaint had been filed about the basketball hoop the Williams had set up in their driveway. According to the complaint, it was an eyesore that lowered the aesthetic standards of the community. "That's ridiculous," Denise said as she read the letter. "Half the families on this street have basketball hoops." Anthony called the HOA president, who sounded embarrassed about the whole thing. "Between you and me, Mr. Williams, we get complaints like this from Walter Jenkins all the time. No one takes them seriously, but we have to follow up on every complaint filed. Your basketball hoop is perfectly fine." Relief was short-lived, however. 2 days later, they received another notice, this time about the volume of their music during a small cookout they'd hosted for Anthony's hospital colleagues. The following week, there was a complaint about the color of the flowers Denise had planted along their front walkway, claiming they weren't in line with the neighborhood's approved color palette. "This is getting ridiculous," Anthony said one evening, tossing the latest HOA letter onto the kitchen table. "He's just trying to make our lives difficult." "I know," Denise agreed. "But if we react, it only gives him what he wants. We need to stay calm and not let him get to us." But staying calm became harder when Walter began parking his car partially, blocking their driveway. When Anthony knocked on his door to ask him to move it, Walter claimed there was plenty of room to get around his car and shut the door again. Then came the loud talk radio shows Walter would play in his backyard, always. When the Williams family was trying to enjoy their own outdoor space, the shows often featured hosts discussing political topics in ways that made the Williams family uncomfortable, with thinly veiled racist commentary that Walter turned up whenever they came outside. "Mom, why does Mr. Jenkins hate us so much?" Isaiah asked one afternoon after Walter had cranked up his radio the moment the boy stepped into the backyard to practice shooting hoops. Denise put her arm around her son's shoulders. "He doesn't really know us, honey. People like Mr. Jenkins are afraid of what they don't understand, and they use that fear to justify treating others poorly. It says more about him than it does about us." Isaiah nodded, but Denise could tell her explanation didn't take away the hurt. The situation escalated further when Walter got a large dog, a German Shepherd that he never seemed to walk. Instead, he would let the dog out into his yard without supervision. The dog, which seemed poorly trained, would bark aggressively whenever any of the Williams family was outside. Worse, Walter began forgetting to pick up after his dog, leaving messes on the edge of the Williams property. "We should host a neighborhood barbecue," Anthony suggested after a particularly tense week. "Invite everyone on the street, including Walter. Maybe if he sees us with the other neighbors, he'll realize we're not so different." Denise agreed it was worth a try. They sent invitations to every house on the block, including a handwritten one to Walter. They spent the day before the barbecue cleaning their backyard, setting up tables and chairs, and preparing food. The day of the barbecue arrived with perfect weather, sunny, but not too hot. Neighbors began arriving around 4 o'clock, bringing side dishes and desserts. Even Mrs. Chen, who usually kept to herself, came with a beautiful platter of homemade spring rolls. By 5, their backyard was full of neighbors chatting, eating, and getting to know each other better. Walter Jenkins was the only one who didn't show up. As the barbecue was winding down, Denise's phone rang. It was the assistant principal from her school. "Denise, I'm sorry to bother you on a weekend," he said, "but I thought you should know. Someone's been calling parents, claiming you don't have the right experience to lead the school and suggesting you only got the job because of political correctness." Denise felt her stomach drop. "Do you know who's making these calls?" "No, but they seem to know details about the neighborhood you live in. They've been suggesting to parents that you live in a rough area and aren't suited for a school in this district." After hanging up, Denise told Anthony about the call. "It has to be Walter," she said. "Who else would do this?" Anthony's face hardened with anger. "This has gone too far. He's trying to damage your professional reputation now." That night, after the kids had gone to bed, Anthony and Denise sat at their kitchen table discussing their options. "Maybe we should talk to a lawyer," Anthony suggested. "This could be considered harassment." "I'm not sure we have enough proof yet," Denise replied. "But I think we should install security cameras. If he's bold enough to try to hurt my career, who knows what else he might do." The next day, Anthony installed cameras covering their front yard, backyard, and driveway. They didn't tell the kids, not wanting to worry them, but they both felt a sense of unease about how quickly their dream home situation had turned into something so stressful. Neither of them could have predicted just how valuable those cameras would prove to be, or the shocking events that would unfold in the coming days when the Williams family planned their first trip away from their new home. 3 weeks had passed since the Williams family installed security cameras around their home. The tension with Walter Jenkins remained, but they had learned to live with his glares and occasional rude comments. Life had fallen into a comfortable rhythm otherwise. Anthony was becoming well respected at the hospital. Denise had successfully started the school year despite the calls to parents, and the kids were adjusting well to their new schools. "I got an email from Uncle Robert today," Anthony said one evening as he helped Denise with dinner. "He's asking if we can come to Atlanta next weekend for Grandma's 80th birthday party." Denise looked up from the vegetables she was chopping. "That would be nice. The kids haven't seen their cousins in ages." "I'm a little worried about leaving the house, though," Anthony admitted, lowering his voice so the kids wouldn't hear from the living room where they were doing homework. "With everything that's been happening with Walter." Denise put down her knife and touched his arm. "We can't let him control our lives, Anthony. We have security cameras now. Besides, it's just for a weekend." Anthony nodded. "You're right. I'll tell Robert we'll be there." The next morning at breakfast, they told the kids about the trip. "Road trip," Isaiah cheered, his face lighting up. "Can we stop at that place with the giant peach on the way?" "And the museum we saw on the way up when we moved here?" Maya added. Unlike her brother, who was making friends easily, Maya had been having a harder time adjusting to her new school. A weekend with her cousins might be just what she needed. "We'll see," Anthony said with a smile. "We'll leave Friday after school and be back Sunday evening." The week passed quickly, and soon, it was Friday afternoon. The family packed their overnight bags into the car, double-checked that all the windows were locked, and set the security system. As they backed out of the driveway, Anthony noticed Walter watching them from his porch. He felt a twinge of unease, but pushed it aside. The security cameras would record anything suspicious, and their neighbors across the street had promised to keep an eye on their house. The drive to Atlanta was filled with music, car games, and stops at roadside attractions that made the 6-hour journey feel shorter. By the time they arrived at Anthony's brother's house, they had temporarily forgotten about Walter Jenkins and the stress he had brought into their lives. Saturday was a joyful day spent celebrating Grandma Williams, a strong, kind woman who had raised 5 children on her own after her husband died young. The party was filled with extended family, good food, and stories that had everyone laughing until tears ran down their cheeks. "You seem more relaxed than you've been in weeks," Anthony's brother Robert commented as they stood on his back porch that evening, watching the cousins play a noisy game of tag in the yard. "It's been a tough transition," Anthony admitted. "Mostly because of this one neighbor who can't seem to accept us." Robert shook his head. Some people are stuck in the past, but don't let one bitter old man steal your joy. That's what Denise keeps telling me, Anthony said with a smile. She's usually right. Sunday morning came too quickly, and after a big family breakfast, the Williams family packed up their car for the drive home. They said their goodbyes with promises to visit again soon and headed back to their new hometown. The sun was setting as they turned onto Oak Tree Lane. Anthony noticed something odd as they approached their house. The porch light they'd left on wasn't shining. "That's strange," he said, slowing the car. "I'm sure we left the porch light on." As they pulled into the driveway, their headlights illuminated their front yard, and Denise gasped. Their carefully planted flower beds had been torn up, dirt and broken plants scattered across the lawn. The kids fell silent in the back seat. "Stay in the car," Anthony said firmly, putting the car in park. His heart was pounding as he got out to take a closer look. What he saw made his blood run cold. Someone had spray-painted ugly words across their garage door, words filled with hate that made his stomach turn. Several windows were broken, glass shards glittering on the walkway. The basketball hoop had been knocked over, the backboard shattered. Anthony heard the car door open behind him and turned to see Denise stepping out, her hand covering her mouth in shock. "Get back in the car," he said urgently. "We don't know if... Is that our house?" Isaiah's small voice came from the backseat window, which he had rolled down to see better. "Stay in the car, buddy," Anthony said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mom and I need to check something." He turned to Denise. "Call the police. I'm going to check the security footage." Anthony used his phone to access their security camera app. The system had captured everything. There, on his small screen, was clear footage of Walter Jenkins sneaking around their property in the dark the night before. The video showed him tearing up their garden, spray painting their garage, and using a hammer to break their windows. The footage was unmistakable. It was definitely Walter, his face clearly visible when he looked up at one point, directly into one of the cameras. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, Anthony and Denise had managed to get the kids inside, through the back door, avoiding the worst of the damage. Officer Rodriguez and his partner took pictures of everything, collected glass samples, and watched the security footage Anthony showed them on his phone. "This is clear evidence, Mr. Williams," Officer Rodriguez said grimly. "We'll need statements from both of you, and then we'll be paying Mr. Jenkins a visit." As they were giving their statements, neighbors began to gather outside, drawn by the police cars with their flashing lights. Mrs. Chen rushed over with a broom and dustpan. The Rodriguez family from down the street brought trash bags. Linda and her husband Tom offered to board up the broken windows temporarily. "We're so sorry this happened to you," Linda said, her eyes filled with tears. "This isn't who we are as a neighborhood." Anthony was touched by the support, but couldn't help feeling a deep sadness. This was supposed to be their dream home, a safe place for their family. Now it felt tainted. From their living room window, they watched as the police officers walked next door and knocked on Walter's door. Through the partially open blinds, they could see Walter's shocked face when the officers told him why they were there. He tried to deny it at first, gesturing wildly, but his protests died down when they mentioned the security footage. The officers handcuffed him and led him to their patrol car. The neighbors who had gathered watched in stunned silence as Walter was driven away. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others looked ashamed, as if somehow responsible for not preventing what had happened. That night, after the kids had finally fallen asleep in the guest room, Maya had refused to sleep in her own room, with the broken window even though it was now securely boarded up. Anthony and Denise sat at their kitchen table, cups of untouched tea growing cold before them. "What do we do now?" Denise asked quietly. "Do we move? Start over somewhere else?" Anthony reached across the table and took her hand. "No, we're not going to let hate drive us from our home. This is our house, our neighborhood. Most of our neighbors have shown us nothing but kindness today. But the kids," Denise said, her voice breaking. "How do we help them feel safe again?" "By showing them that we're not afraid," Anthony replied. by teaching them that one person's hatred doesn't define a community. They sat in silence for a moment, then Denise squeezed his hand. "We'll need to go to court, won't we? To testify? Against Walter?" Anthony nodded. "Yes, but the evidence is clear. The police said they're charging him with property damage, vandalism, and hate crimes. Neither of them could have imagined what would happen in that courtroom, or the shocking connection that would be revealed between their family and the man who had caused them so much pain." The weeks following Walter's arrest were difficult for the Williams family. The physical damage to their home was repaired. Insurance covered most of it, and neighbors pitched in to help with the rest. The kids returned to school, though both were quieter than before. Maya had nightmares for several nights, and Isaiah started asking to be driven to school instead of walking with his friends. What couldn't be fixed so easily was the sense of violation, the knowledge that someone had deliberately targeted them because of who they were. Anthony and Denise put on brave faces for their children, but when they were alone, they sometimes found themselves wondering if they had made a mistake in choosing this neighborhood. 6 weeks after the incident, the day of Walter's court hearing arrived. The district attorney had warned them that they would likely need to testify as the main victims in the case. Anthony had taken the day off from the hospital, and Denise had arranged for a substitute principal at her school. "Are you sure you don't want me to come?" Maya asked that morning, her voice earnest. At 16, she was old enough to understand what was happening. "I could testify too." "That's brave of you to offer," Anthony said, touched by his daughter's courage. "But Mom and I can handle this. You and Isaiah focus on school today." The courthouse was an imposing brick building in the center of town. As they walked up the broad stone steps, Denise squeezed Anthony's hand. "Ready?" she asked. He nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." Inside, they were directed to a courtroom on the second floor. The district attorney, a woman named Grace Powell, met them in the hallway. "The security footage is very clear," she assured them. "With that and your testimony, we have a strong case. Mr. Jenkins is being charged with criminal mischief, vandalism, and hate crimes. What kind of sentence might he face?" Denise asked. "Given his age and lack of prior criminal record, probably not prison time," Ms. Powell admitted. "But substantial fines, probation, and community service are likely. The hate crime charges are the most serious." They entered the courtroom and took seats behind Ms. Powell's table. A few minutes later, Walter was brought in by a bailiff. Anthony was shocked at how much older Walter looked after just 6 weeks in custody. His shoulders were hunched, his face gaunt. For a brief moment, Anthony felt a pang of sympathy for the old man, before remembering the hateful words spray-painted on their garage. The judge entered and everyone stood. Judge Hernandez was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He called the court to order and the proceedings began. Ms. Powell presented the state's case efficiently, showing the security footage on a large screen for the judge and court to see. There were a few gasps from people in the gallery as they watched Walter methodically destroying the Williams property. When it was time for Anthony to testify, he walked to the witness stand feeling strangely calm. He described how they had found their home vandalized upon returning from their trip, and the impact it had had on their family. He spoke of Maya's nightmares and Isaiah's fear of walking to school. His voice remained steady, but he could see several jurors wiping away tears. Denise testified next, explaining how she had tried to be friendly to Walter from the beginning, only to be met with hostility. She described the calls that had been made to parents at her school, though she admitted they couldn't prove Walter was behind them. Walter's attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named Mr. Graves, didn't ask many questions during cross-examination. His client's guilt was clear from the video evidence. Instead, he seemed to be focusing on presenting Walter as an elderly man who had made a terrible mistake and deserved leniency. When both sides had presented their cases, the judge called a brief recess before final statements. Anthony and Denise stepped out into the hallway for some air. "You both did well in there," Ms. Powell told them. "The judge seemed sympathetic to your family's suffering." As they were talking, Anthony noticed a young woman walking toward them hesitantly. She looked to be in her late 20s with light brown hair pulled back in a ponytail. There was something vaguely familiar about her, but Anthony couldn't place where he might have seen her before. "Dr. Williams?" she asked tentatively. "I'm not sure if you remember me. My name is Beth Richards. You saved my life when I was 12. Anthony's mind raced, trying to place her among the thousands of patients he had treated over his career. Then it clicked. A terrible car accident. A young girl with severe internal bleeding. An emergency surgery that had lasted nearly 8 hours. "Beth," he said, recognition dawning. "Of course I remember you. That must be about 15 years ago now. How are you?" "I'm great," she said with a smile. "Thanks to you. I'm a nurse now, actually, partly because of what you did for me." "That's wonderful," Anthony said, genuinely pleased. "But what brings you to court today?" Beth's smile faded. "I'm here because of my grandfather. Walter Jenkins is my grandfather." Anthony and Denise exchanged shocked glances. "Walter is your grandfather?" Denise asked. Beth nodded, looking uncomfortable. "Yes, I just found out what he did to your family. I've been away at nursing school in California. My mom called me when he was arrested. I came as soon as I could, but I've been so ashamed that I couldn't bring myself to reach out to you until now." "You have nothing to be ashamed of," Anthony assured her. "You're not responsible for your grandfather's actions. There's something you should know," Beth said, her voice dropping. "My grandfather doesn't know it was you who saved me. When the accident happened, he was out of town. By the time he got to the hospital, I was recovering, and he never met the surgeon. All he knew was that a doctor had saved his granddaughter's life." Anthony was silent for a moment, processing this information. Would it make a difference if he knew? "I don't know," Beth admitted. "He's been different since my grandmother died. Bitter, angry. But before that, he was a different person. He loved my grandmother so much. When she died, it was like all the goodness went out of him." Ms. Powell, who had been listening to their conversation, spoke up. "Dr. Williams, would you be willing to mention this connection when you make your victim impact statement? It might not change anything legally, but it might change something in Walter," Denise finished for her. "I think you should, Anthony." When court resumed, it was time for victim impact statements before the judge announced the sentence. Anthony approached the podium again, his heart racing now in a way it hadn't during his testimony. "Your Honor, I've been a heart surgeon for 15 years, he began. "I've saved many lives in that time, and I've lost some too. Every patient matters to me, regardless of who they are or what they look like." He turned slightly to look at Walter, who was staring down at the table in front of him. "Mr. Jenkins, 15 years ago, a 12-year-old girl was brought into my emergency room after a terrible car accident. She was bleeding internally and needed immediate surgery. I operated on her for 8 hours that night, refusing to give up even when other doctors thought we should." "That girl was your granddaughter, Beth." Walter's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. "You never knew who the surgeon was that night because you were out of town when it happened. By the time you got to the hospital, I was off duty. But I remember Beth. I remember every patient whose life I've been able to save." The courtroom was completely silent now. Walter was staring at Anthony, his mouth slightly open, his face pale. "And there's more," Anthony continued, glancing at Denise, who nodded encouragingly. "My wife, Denise, is the anonymous donor who established the scholarship fund at the community college in memory of your late wife, Eleanor Jenkins. When Denise was researching the school district before accepting her position as principal, she read about Eleanor's 30 years of teaching at the college and wanted to honor her legacy." A small sound escaped Walter, something between a gasp and a sob. His lawyer put a hand on his arm to steady him. "We didn't know any of this when we moved in next door to you," Anthony said. "We were just a family looking for a nice place to raise our children. We didn't deserve what you did to our home and, more importantly, our sense of safety and belonging. But despite that, we don't hate you, Mr. Jenkins. We feel sorry for you because hate has blinded you to the point where you couldn't see who we really are." Anthony returned to his seat. The judge, looking visibly moved, called a brief recess. As the bailiff led Walter out, the old man's eyes followed Anthony, filled with confusion and the first glimmer of something that might have been shame. When court resumed after the recess, Walter Jenkins looked like a different man. His shoulders, which had been hunched defensively throughout the proceedings, now sagged with what appeared to be the weight of revelation. He kept glancing at Anthony and Denise, his eyes filled with confusion and growing shame. Judge Hernandez cleared his throat. "Before I announce my decision, does the defendant wish to make a statement?" Walter's lawyer leaned over and whispered something to him. Walter nodded and slowly rose to his feet. I would like to speak, Your Honor," he said, his voice raspy. "Go ahead, Mr. Jenkins," the judge said. Walter turned slightly to face Anthony and Denise. "I don't know what to say," he began. "I've lived with anger for so long that I forgot how to see people as people." He paused, his hands trembling. "What I did was wrong. There's no excuse for it. I didn't know about Beth, about the scholarship. But even if none of that were true, what I did was still wrong." He took a shaky breath. "I miss my wife every day. Eleanor would be so ashamed of what I've become. She taught me to be better than this." Walter turned back to the judge. "I accept. Whatever punishment the court decides is fair, Your Honor." Judge Hernandez nodded thoughtfully. After considering for a moment, he announced his decision. Walter would receive a suspended sentence conditional on 2 years of probation, mandatory attendance at anti-racism education programs, full restitution for the damage to the Williams home, and 500 hours of community service. "Mr. Jenkins," the judge added, "I'm giving you this chance because of your age, your lack of prior criminal record, and your apparent remorse. Don't make me regret it." After the hearing concluded, Anthony and Denise stepped into the hallway. Beth was waiting for them, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for what you said in there, and for saving my life all those years ago." "How is your grandfather doing?" Denise asked gently. "He's shaken," Beth replied. "I've never seen him like this before. He asked me if it was true, if Dr. Williams was really the one who saved me that night. When I told him yes, he just sat there crying." Anthony felt a mix of emotions, satisfaction that Walter was facing consequences for his actions, but also a strange sense of hope that something good might come from this terrible situation. "No, my grandfather did something unforgivable," Beth continued. "But would it be possible for you to talk with him? Just once? I think it might help him understand what he's done." Anthony and Denise exchanged glances. "We can try," Anthony said finally. "Not today, but soon." A week later, Walter was released to begin his probation. The first meeting between the two families took place at Beth's apartment, neutral ground for everyone involved. Walter sat stiffly on the edge of a chair, looking older and more fragile than Anthony remembered. "I'm not here for apologies," Anthony said as they sat across from each other. "Words won't fix what happened." Walter nodded, his eyes downcast. "I understand. But I am here to offer you a choice," Anthony continued. "Part of your community service hours could be served working with me at the free clinic I volunteer at, twice a month. It serves people who can't afford regular health care, all kinds of people." Walter looked up surprised. "You'd let me work alongside you? After what I did?" "This isn't about forgiveness," Anthony clarified. "It's about giving you a chance to see people differently, to learn." "I'll do it," Walter said without hesitation. "If they'll have me there." The following Saturday, Walter showed up at the community health clinic in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. Anthony introduced him as a volunteer and assigned him to help with intake forms and organizing supplies. Walter worked silently, watching as Anthony treated patients of all backgrounds with the same care and respect. At first, Walter was met with suspicious glances from the other volunteers who had heard about the case. But over the weeks that followed, as he showed up reliably and worked hard, those glances softened. During his 3rd month at the clinic, an emergency case came in, a young boy having a severe asthma attack. As Anthony worked to stabilize the child, he called out for specific equipment. Without hesitation, Walter had everything ready, anticipating what would be needed next. After the boy was stabilized and his grateful mother had taken him home with new medication, Anthony found Walter sitting alone in the break room. "You did good work today," Anthony said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "I used to be a medical supply salesman before I retired," Walter explained. "I know my way around emergency equipment." He paused. "The boy reminded me of my grandson, Beth's little brother. He had asthma too." It was the first personal detail Walter had shared, a small opening but significant. As the months passed, Walter continued working at the clinic. He attended his required anti-racism education sessions, but he also began doing extra reading on his own. One day, Anthony found Walter deep in conversation with one of the clinic's regular patients, an elderly black woman who was a retired history teacher. They were discussing a book about the civil rights movement that Walter had just read. At home, Anthony and Denise noticed a change in their neighborhood as well. The word had spread about what had happened, and many neighbors made extra efforts to be welcoming. Maya was invited to join the art club at school, and Isaiah's basketball team started practicing in their driveway some afternoons. 6 months after the vandalism, the neighborhood association approached the Williams family about hosting a block party. "We want to show that this is a community that stands against hate," explained Linda, who had helped board up their windows that terrible night. The day of the block party arrived with perfect spring weather. Tables lined the street, loaded with potluck dishes from dozens of families. Children played games on the Williams' front lawn and music filled the air. Even Beth came, bringing her mother and her little brother. Midway through the afternoon, Walter arrived looking nervous. He had been living with Beth since his release, too ashamed to return to his house next door to the Williams family. A hush fell over the gathering as people noticed him. Walter made his way to where Anthony and Denise stood. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'd like to say something to everyone, if that's all right," he said quietly. Anthony nodded and someone turned down the music. Walter turned to face the gathered neighbors. "Many of you know what I did," he began, his voice stronger than expected. "I vandalized the Williams home because I couldn't see past the color of their skin. I was wrong, not just in what I did, but in how I thought." He looked around at the faces watching him. "I've been learning a lot these past months. Working at the clinic with Dr. Williams, reading books I should have read long ago, listening to people whose experiences are different from mine. I can't undo what I did, but I can try to be better from now on." Walter turned to Anthony and Denise. "I'm putting my house up for sale. You deserve neighbors who appreciate what good people you are. But before I go, I wanted to apologize publicly. The way I harmed you publicly. I'm truly sorry." There was a moment of silence, then Denise stepped forward. "Thank you for saying that, Walter. It means a lot to hear." The party continued and Walter stayed, sitting quietly at first, but eventually talking with a few neighbors. As the afternoon wore on, Anthony watched as Isaiah cautiously approached Walter and asked him about the best fishing spots in the local lake, something Walter had mentioned at the clinic once. To Anthony's surprise, Walter's face lit up as he described his favorite fishing spots, using his hands to show how big the fish were. It wasn't perfect reconciliation. Some wounds take more than months to heal. But watching his son talk with the man who had once targeted their family, Anthony felt a cautious hope. People could change, communities could heal, and sometimes, the most unlikely connections could lead to transformation.